Hello everyone, I am Nilanjana Sengupta. I am a faculty at the School of Development, Azim Premji University. Today I have a very special guest with me. Her name is Gita Sen. She's a renowned feminist economist. So one of the first ways in which I was introduced to her work is through one of her books called Development Crisis and Alternative Visions, Third World Women's Perspectives. It intrigued me a lot because it gave a third world women's perspectives to the ongoing crisis of that time, which is the late 1980s and to mid 1980s and the late 1980s. Gita Sen has been teaching for a very long time at IIM Bangalore, at the Centre for Development Studies, Trivandrum. She was also teaching at Harvard University. Right now, she's retired from teaching, but currently she's associated with PHFI Bangalore. So, welcome, Gita. It's a real great pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Nilanjana. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. I don't know how renowned I am, but I'm happy to be here.
So I would also want to take this opportunity to say that Gita is also here because of a very interesting conference that is happening. It's called Rethinking Labor, Gender Informality and Politics. Today, Gita, we'll be talking a little bit about development crisis and alternatives in India today. And I would like to begin the discussion by asking you that it's been now, about 3-4 decades since that book came out. And of course, a lot has happened. A lot of water has flown under the bridge. We have had globalization. We have had a very different kind of world order emerging. And even in India, the policies have also undergone so much of change. So if I were to ask you, in your opinion, how has the nature of crisis shifted and how have the nature of alternatives also shifted? If you can tell us a bit.
Okay, that is a huge question, as you know, when you ask it. See, at the time that we started Dawn, and Dawn will actually be completing its 40th year this year, 2024, much obviously has changed. And yet, at some level, if you think about gender equality, women's development, questions of economic and social justice. The glass is, in some respects, maybe 20% full and still 80% empty. Why do I say that? At the time that that book was written, the world was just about at the beginnings of what we now call our neoliberal globalization. It was the early to mid 80s when the thinking around that book happened, and it happened because a group of women, largely from all parts of what used to be called the Third World at that time, which is in the title of the book, what we call the Global South. Now, Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, the Pacific came together to just brainstorm ahead of the Third World Women's Conference that was supposed to happen in Nairobi in 1985 to sort of think aloud with each other about the nature of our experiences with what was happening with development policies, what was the nature of our states, what was happening in terms of international economic and political relations, and whether we had something to offer that was different from what was already there. And I think if I were to summarize, I won't get into the history of how the book was written, which was itself a collective process, and a quite fascinating one. Quite new for all of us. But in that collective process, the thing that I suppose this sentence that would crystallize the core of the book was this a take on what was at that time the challenge for the global women's movements, which was, do we go for gender equality And if so, what happens to development and what happens to peace? Because it was supposed to be the decade for development, equality, and peace. And all of the focus was on gender equality. And our question was, how can you talk about gender equality in the narrow sense of equality between men and women without talking about the nature of development? And so we crystallized it by saying, who wants an equal or larger share of a poisoned pie? If the pie of development is poisoned, is problematic. And to us at that time, at the beginnings of structural adjustment, austerity programs, the beginnings of globalization, which was leading to privatization and workers losing jobs, health and education, advances that had been made after colonialism, sort of being short-shrifted and taking a backseat. If we were looking at what was happening in terms of opportunities for women in work, in the recognition of unpaid women's unpaid work, all of that seemed to be in the throes of a crisis. And of course, there were the larger crises, the crises that the world was talking about, the debt crisis of that time, the food and famine crisis of that time, the militarization crisis of that time. When I keep saying of that time, you sort of think of that time, what about this time? And so, of course, we had our own take on that. And I think in many ways, the book captured what was in many people's, many feminists and women's movements and many others, many progressive people's concerns at that time that the book was able to capture and mobilize. So in a sense, if I think between then and now, what has happened and what has shifted, I think we went from the phase of hard privatization, liberalization, to what might be called a more subtle liberalization. We didn't talk about privatization so much in the 90s in this country as we did talk about privatization, but we began increasingly to talk about public-private partnerships as being the name of the game, where in fact public-private partnerships turned out to be much worse than pure, straightforward privatization. Because in privatization, it was the private sector comes in, it puts in its money, and it gets what it can out of by way of profits. With public-private partnerships, the private sector puts in public money, correct, and corners the profits. So it's worse. It's a win-win for the private sector and a lose-lose for everybody on the other side, including workers who are employed by the public sector. So in a sense, our work as well, in terms of the nature of the privatization development crises, has moved forward to reflect that. And Dawn has actually just recently brought out a book of case studies on public-private partnerships in health, in power sector, in roads, and so on, a gendered take on that across different countries. At the same time, we started looking at other things. We were very concerned about the interplay and relationship between what you might think of as women in the economy and women's bodily autonomy and integrity. So sexual and reproductive health and rights. And how that is central to women's very being and existence. If a woman is being sexually abused, does it matter if she's being abused by a random person on the street, by her uncle in the home, or by her supervisor on the workplace? All of which we know happens. And in fact, far more than the random person on the street, it's the latter two that are much more common in terms of the flouting of women's bodily rights and autonomy. So as Dawn, we felt that we really did need to get into those questions and to see the interconnections between those. And of course, the world has moved on. So right now, if I think about the big Dawn work that we're doing, we're working on feminist digital justice. And we're doing that along with Bangalore's own IT for Change as a partnership between IT for Change and Dawn. We're working on something where we are one of the few larger organizations, by larger, we're not large in numbers, but in terms of our scope, organizations working on something like deep sea mining. Now you might say, what on earth does deep sea mining have to do with gender equality? Well, it turns out that deep sea mining is seen by many, especially in the IT industry, as the new frontier, because the polymetallic nodules that are mined out of the deep oceans and have the rare minerals that are in our cell phones.
Okay.
So the IT industry and digital justice are very closely connected to the devastation of the oceans that may come from deep sea mining. And because Dawn exists and we have a thriving office in the Pacific, and the Pacific Ocean is where much of this is happening, we have a project on deep sea mining. So we, in a sense, I guess, we go where the crises are, you might say. We sound like sort of birds of Iloman, but in a sense, I guess, we try and be as responsive. We keep our ears to the ground, and we try and be as responsive as we can to what women and people on the ground are telling us about the nature of their lives and the reality of what's going on.
That's very interesting. But before moving to the next question, I just wanted to say that for those who do not know, Dawn refers to development alternatives with women for a new era. And Gita was one of the founding members, and it was also set up in the same year when the book that we were talking about came out. So to move on, you talked about this moment when we are talking about gender equality, we are also talking about development, and there seems to be sometimes a kind of, they are sometimes seen as alternatives, sometimes they seem to be related, but they are not necessarily always working together. So I have another question that is very pertinent to today, where, as many of us are all aware that in India, we have a very low women's workforce participation rate. So policymakers, activists, scholars, we are all calling for different ways through which we can increase women's workforce participation rate. At the same time, we also know that there is a huge critique about the kind of work that women, the kind of paid work that women are also engaged in. So be it, a lot of that work is casualized. A lot of that work is very low productive. A lot of that work is also very low paying. So, and of course, we are also talking about the fact that we need to actually break down the binary between paid and unpaid. A lot of the unpaid work that women do need to be valued. So my question to you here would be that what currently, if you are talking to policymakers, what currently should be our focus and our investment? Should we talk about different ways through which we can increase women's workforce participation, or should we invest more in enabling decent work for women?
Both together is what I would say. And let me just start maybe with a caveat in response. The most recent periodic labor force survey put out by the Government of India suggests that women's labor force participation rates and work participation have gone up.
Correct.
And have gone up quite significantly. What is going on? Because and there's obviously been quite a bit of jubilation around that. I think that if we look at the evidence a little more carefully, what we see, if we look at sort of broad categories of employment into which both men and women workers fall, which includes on-account workers. That is, you're working for yourself meaning for the market, but you are your own master or mistress. Or you're an employer employing others. So that's one category together. Then there's the category of household labor, meaning unpaid family workers who are heavily women, in fact. And then you have the categories of, regular salaried wage work or casual labor. Now, interestingly, if we look at the period from about 2017, the last 5 years or so, let's say, and we know that the labor force participation rate has actually been declining longer than that. But in the last 5 years or so, if we compare 2017-18 to the most recent figures from last year, women's employment in casual labor has fallen. The share of regular wage work has fallen. The share of unpaid family work has increased a little bit, not a huge amount, couple of percentage points. What seems to have increased significantly is on-account work. A big increase between 2017 and now, almost like a 10 percentage point increase, which is behind this apparent big increase in the labor force participation rate. Who are these workers? We, of course, don't know, and we cannot tell from the larger surveys of the government. But from working in this area for quite a long time, to be an on-account worker, you have to have resources, both financial, sometimes physical capital, and you have to, if you are yourself going to be an employer, you have to be able to have the wherewithal, the working capital to be able to employ others. How many women have that in this country? Negligible. So your on-account workers are probably those in desperation now, because casual labor is gone, regular employment is gone, and there's not much scope more to absorb unpaid family workers, the extra woman who sits in the little kirana shop.
Yes.
But that's who the unpaid family worker typically is. There's not much scope for that, clearly. So they're forced, in order to earn an income, to do things like getting a push cart and selling vegetables, or, selling guavas on the corner, or all these kinds of petty work that typically fruit and vegetable selling is the big thing in the cities. And the women that you find sitting on the, typically on the ground with the tarpaulin beneath their vegetables, that's what we're thinking of when we think about on-account work. What it means is that in this era of full-scale liberalization of the economy is closely linked to the decline in work opportunities for both men and women, but particularly, I said that what is happening to women workers is like the miner's canary. The British coal miners used to carry a little bird, a canary, in a cage ahead of them in the days when mines were so dangerous. So that as long as the canary was alive, it meant the deadly gases in the mine were not nearby. If the canary looked like it was dying or gasping, the miners ran. because they knew that the gases were coming in the mines. And I said at that time, what is happening to women's work? Women workers are like the miner's canary, because we can already see the fall that is taking place after years of a struggle to get women back into work. Another of the reasons this has happened, of course, is because the place that used to be the one that employed women workers at reasonable terms, on reasonable terms, reasonable pay, reasonable conditions of work, was the government. Central government, state government, different kinds of services, auxiliary nurse midwives, and others, A&Ms. The government doesn't want to do that, and it's all a piece of the liberalization economy, which, because it has pressured governments to cut their spending, they now increasingly want women to come in and do the work in education as para-teachers, in health as ashas, in a whole range of the services they still want to provide, but they want to provide it on the cheap. They want to hire women workers, but now without any of the guarantees that were there before. And quite often, if you speak to the IS officers in charge, good people, they say, oh, it saves us from the hassle of having to deal with strikes. We don't have to deal with strikes. If they don't work, they're out. To the point where, as we know, ASHA stands for a volunteer.
Exactly.
And all of these people are called volunteers. They don't refer to themselves as or think of themselves as volunteers, and no way are they volunteers. They're just badly piece rate paid workers, and that's where women are coming in. So that buffer that was growing and expanding during the period when India's poverty rates were declining as well, seems to have eroded very badly the public sector for women, public sector in services, which is where women were in. So all of this put together tells us that what we're seeing is actually both things coming together. It's not that labor force participation truly is increasing in ways that would ensure quality work, and at the same time, the quality of the jobs and the work that women are getting has been significantly eroded and is eroding.
That's absolutely right. And even during this conference, we were also discussing this question of frontline workers, and very interestingly, the state has actually been subsidizing a lot of its welfare schemes through the labor of these women. And so be it health, be it food provision, so look at midday meal schemes, all the cooks are women, and different other things. These are all women workers. And they have no guarantees, they have they don't have regular wages, they are basically paid on a piece rate basis, as you said. But this again brings me to this question of health, because in the health industry, we see so many women. During COVID also, we saw so many women, nurses, ayas, the ASHA workers, just going out there and basically helping the society to combat this major pandemic. But what about women's health? And I know that currently you've been working on women's health. Given the nature of work women do, given that most of them are in these informal work arrangements, where they have neither any social security nor security of tenure, which means also they don't have any kind of access to claims or medical insurance and stuff like that. What is the state of their health and access to health services? If you can tell us a bit about that.
See, the pandemic sort of really brought this home in a very dramatic way. A fellow at the PHFI Centre, where I used to work, talked about this. She's a medical doctor from Tamil Nadu. She said one of the very striking things is we're all, during the pandemic and during the height of the pandemic, we're all working 24/7. There's just no doctors, nurses, frontline workers, everybody. The differences and the hierarchies remain though. So if the doctor is expected to be on call all of the time, he will at least have some camp cot-like thing in a room to sleep in at night. But where do the ayahs who are there, and where do the frontline workers who are bringing the patients in, where do they go and what do they do? What kind of personal protective equipment do they get? How are they treated? If they have to be on call like this, what rest do they get? So the pandemic, I think, brought out the problem of the huge gendered hierarchies in the health workforce that we have very dramatically. But the other challenge that we have is that one of the things that happened during the heyday of NRHM, whatever we may think about the strategy of insisting that all women must only deliver babies within institutions, which has its pros and its cons, there's no question but that the overall strategy certainly had a big role in reducing maternal deaths in the country significantly. And this was no mean achievement, given that India, along with Nigeria, is one of the 2 countries in the world with the highest maternal mortality ratios. So big achievement, no question about that. More recently, for reasons that are not, entirely clear to me, the health ministry, the government seems to have been backpedaling on NRHM. And NRHM, or NHM as it's called, not just rural, but rural plus urban, doesn't seem to be getting the kind of investments that it still needs in order to see those advances moving forward. But there are many other areas of health for women that are getting very short shrift. One of the questions which we've barely scratched the surface of is how do we ensure occupational health for a largely unregulated workforce? Well, one of the ways in which you have to do it is through the public system. There's no other way of doing it. The private sector certainly is not interested in investing in preventive health or promotive health. It wants curative health where it can make lots of money. That's their job. That's what they want to do. So if you want to ensure the health of women in the workplace, in the home, at different points and stages in the life course, both their health and their rights to bodily autonomy and integrity, the public sector is absolutely, this has to be the centerpiece. That's why what happened in the last few years in Rajasthan, for instance, on the backs of the Jan Swasthya Abhiyan movement, the big push towards passing a right to health law in Rajasthan and ensuring health was very much a step in the right direction. If we do not pay as much or more attention to primary care, to prevention and promotion of good health practices, and only invest in preventive care, that is ensuring that once you have a cancer, you will get treated, whether you're rich or poor. That's important. That's important and essential, and that's what makes such programs very popular. Because when a family is facing a crisis because of a heart attack or a stroke or cancer or one of the non-communicable diseases, they want access to decent health care. It's too late for prevention. at that time. But you have to prevent as many people as possible from getting to that stage, because that is the most expensive stage. It's also the least productive stage in terms of how much health you get for how much money you invest. Prevention is much better. To prevent cancer, to prevent a heart attack is much better, both for the person who doesn't become a patient, as well as for the system as a whole that has to invest in this. So if you ask me, that's the direction that we need to go. And all too much we've been going the route of putting too many resources on the curative side and not enough resources on the primary care side, on the preventive and promotive side. There's talk about the preventive and promotive, but ultimately money talks. And the question is, how much money, what investment, how many people are you hiring, what kinds of importance are you giving to that?
Thank you so much, Geeta. This has been an excellent conversation. I have learned so much, and I'm sure everybody who's listening to this program has also learned a lot. We look forward to having you here again at some later date. And of course, we look forward to also reading the new work that you'll be publishing. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Nilanjana.